Good morning, everyone. Or I guess good evening if you're in the other part of the world. My name is Sidney Li. I'm the director of the World Social Forum. Uh, this year, I also have the pleasure of serving as the Undersecretary General for Operations. So I'm really excited for you to meet our speakers and sponsors once we get to conference, and especially, I guess, for you all here to see you at the World Social Forum Committee. It's going to be a very exciting committee. As you might have realized from your delegation assignments, it's not a completely traditional committee, even though we'll be using many of the elements of a traditional committee. But this webinar should give you an introduction to how the committee will work, what I'm looking for, what you should anticipate, and what kinds of, and in what ways the World Social Forum is different from other committees at a Mall United Nations conference. Just to give you a bit of context, I'm currently a rising junior at Harvard University. I'm studying social studies. That's our name for politics, philosophy, and economics. And I've been doing MALD-UN since freshman year of high school. So I'm going into my 7th year of MUN, and it's been a very exciting ride. I used to be a crisis delegate, and now I've moved more towards the Ecosoc direction. So the World Social Forum is a Ecosoc crisis hybrid, best of both worlds, I'd like to think. In some places, in some MALD-UN conferences, people like to call it a Crisosoc, a mix of crisis and Ecosoc. To break it down, let's first talk about the differences between a GA or Ecosoc committee and a crisis committee. There are three, I think, main points of difference here: the committee topic, the committee progression, and the requisite skills. For the committee topic, GA or Ecosoc committee tends to have a broader, complex topic. For example, prosecuting genocide. And the whole point of committee is to explore the subtopics, to explore the existing international policy for those topics and create new international policy through compromise and through debate. While for crisis, the committee topic is more time-specific and event-driven. You can think of the Iran-Iraq War, which is one of the committee topics that's being run this year at HMUN India. It takes place in a very specific time frame. The policies that are made during that time frame are often very specific to what's going on at that point in that part of the world. And there's less of a dependence on the history of international policy and more on both domestic policy, the interests of the actors, of the delegates and the cabinet members who are in the committee, as well as the immediate consequences of current policy. So it's shorter term, much shorter time frame. Second point of consideration is committee progression. GA and Ecosoc committees tend to be deliberative committees. That means that you work towards a resolution, and a shift in committee topic comes in a shift in debate focus. It's kind of how we think the United Nations or the state legislature or the Lok Sabha, how those big bodies work. While crisis committees tend to be crisis-based, they have crisis arcs. You as delegates can write crisis notes, and you can also collaborate to write directives or joint crisis notes. And each of those three things, arcs, notes, and directives, work together to change what happens in the committee, to move it forward, to change the issue that's being discussed, right? So maybe a crisis note will involve bombing a certain location. That's going to completely change the policies of some delegates in the committee and also what an eventual directive is going to look like. While for GA and Ecosoc committees, what's happening in the real world remains quite stable. And the third I think most important part are the requisite skills for a GA and Ecosoc committee and a crisis committee. In GA and Ecosoc, the premium is placed on speaking and negotiation. Obviously, skills from a GA and Ecosoc committee translate well to skills in a crisis committee and vice versa. But it tends to be more important to be good at speaking and negotiation in a GA and Ecosoc committee because you only have limited chances to talk. While in a crisis committee, there's a premium placed on thinking on your feet and being creative. Because the committee is smaller, you'll be talking constantly. Because you have kind of ownership over where the committee is going through your crisis notes and through your directives, You have to think on your feet to respond quickly to what's going on in the real world, um, to speak often, influence often, and react quickly. So that's kind of the general split. Obviously, the line isn't clear cut. Clear cut. There are mixes, and the World Social Forum definitely is one of those mixes. On the other hand, there is also some similarities between a GA and Ecosoc committee and a crisis committee. Both require in-depth knowledge of the topic. You have to read the background guide. You have to write your update papers. You have to do your own research and start thinking in advance about what you're going to say in committee and what you're going to think about, what issues you want to consider. And that preparation is necessary for either committee. Just because you're in a crisis committee doesn't mean that you can get there, see what's going on, and then suddenly start. Second one is diplomatic conduct and compromise are tools for success. Although the GA and Ecosoc committees rely more on negotiation, they still crisis committees still require you to be not only polite but cognizant of the other party's interests and also cognizant of the ways to convince them and negotiate with them to ensure that both your interests and their interests are put on the table. Third one is scoping out the future is important for a delegate strategy. Once you're in committee, you're not just memorizing all the numbers that you got from the background guide and your own research and your position papers. The facts at some point don't matter. You have to see, you have to anticipate what's going to happen later. What is the leader of this bloc going to do, and what can I do to plan for that? What's the next issue going to be, and am I going to be the one who pivots the committee to that next issue, or am I going to have the resolution that addresses that issue? Once we start debating the resolution, what am I going to think about once that happens? Am I going to try to create a resolution that covers everything, maybe at a shallow level, and argue that my resolution is the most comprehensive, or one that goes very in-depth, one that goes to very, very deep on one or two or maybe only three issues and addresses them really well? And depending on which type of resolution I make, how can I use that strategically in my quest to gain the most votes for the resolution? And the fourth one is you want to make the most of your assigned delegation. I think a common joke in United Nations is getting assigned a country like Tuvalu that you've never heard of before, that may not have a lot of resources or influence in the real world, in the actual United Nations, but still you have to make do with it. And I think United Nations is a very, very egalitarian activity once you get into this. When you first start committee, you can have either United States or Tuvalu, and you can still have the same shot at winning. And it's really about thinking what the pressure points are with your delegation, how you can direct committee debate to those pressure points, and leverage that committee debate and leverage your own country's stance and resources to win that debate. So now let's put everything together. What is a Ecosoc? Also, so I'm sure many of you have questions as I'm talking about this. We will have a question and answer session at the end. It'll be probably around 20 minutes of a question and answer session. So definitely save your questions for then, and maybe even type them into the chat now, and I'll address them once we get there. So back to the agenda. What is a Ecosoc? Ecosoc, as I said before, is a hybrid Ecosoc and crisis committee. And I'll go deeper into that, but essentially what this means is there are going to be a lot of constant crisis breaks. The real world, the real world that you're dealing with while you're a delegate in the committee is always going to be changing. It's not going to be stable like a GA. It's also not going to be changing like really fast or with a lot of uncertainty like in a crisis committee. And that's because there will be no crisis notes. I just want to repeat that. There will be no crisis notes. Although the dais will be releasing crisis breaks to the committee that you'll be using directives or resolutions to deal with, delegates themselves won't be able to write crisis notes to influence the topic. And I think that's very important because a lot of you are assigned organizations instead of countries. And a lot of these organizations do have their own resources and powers and can do things like like provide funding to this area, move like people to this area. That's all true, but that's not something we want to focus on, and therefore, once again, there will be no crisis notes. Um, in the World Social Forum, we'll be working toward both a resolution and a directive. So in the first half of a conference, we're going to be focusing on a resolution. If you have taken a look at the World Social Forum background guide, there are some major issues presented. In fact, the biggest issue is humanitarian aid, NGO humanitarian aid for states in transition. And we are going to be creating a resolution that's focused on that topic, that's going to be addressing the policies and problems associated with that topic. Obviously, we aren't countries, so none of these things are operating in the same way the United Nations operates. Yet at the same time, you can still make recommendations for what NGOs do, create pointers, create organizations, create other subsidiaries of certain existing international organizations to help carry out your policies. But the resolution, as in a regular GA or Ecosoc, is a very broad thing. It exists to make recommendations for future policy and isn't itself an instant call to action, although it may contain some parts like that. They should address the topic as a whole. And the second half of conference, the DICE is going to unleash crises and directives, which explore the subtopics that we listed in both the background guide and the update papers. We're going to explore the shortcomings of the resolution. Once we have certain resolutions that are passed, we're going to think about what are things that this resolution has addressed really well, and that you can use as resources to address in your directives against crises. For example, you created a bank to fund microloans in a certain city, and suddenly a big economic downturn happens in the country that city is in, and you can use the funds from that bank to rebuild the city or maybe even rebuild the country. So that's a positive example. A negative example would be part of your resolution attempts to protect humanitarian aid workers from coup d'etats, from the violence, and wants to reduce manslaughter. But you forgot to implement one measure that didn't foresee this one thing happening, maybe by a terrorist group, maybe by something else, but it wasn't comprehensive enough. And then we release a crisis on that measure for you to address it, so that you can maybe submit an amendment to the resolution or create a directive that alters the situation. And the whole idea is to make you to think more critically about your resolution. In many MALD-UN conferences, you pass your resolution and you're done. I think you should think about that the debate doesn't stop when the resolution is passed, but that's when the debate starts. Policy is only policy because there's an implementation, and the implementation will tell you whether a policy is good or bad, and that's what we'll be doing with the crisis breaks and directives. And we'll also be exploring topics related to but not deeply addressed in the background guide that are associated with humanitarian aid for safety transition, and that's just to throw in some spice into the committee. I'm sure you'll be doing a lot of research, not only in the topic, you'll also come across a lot of things that are tangentially related, and we may touch on something like that. Although that won't be the focus of the second half of the conference, the crises and directives will still focus on the stuff listed already in the background guide and under the topic as a whole. So at Harvard, at least, many people have asked me, why Ecosoc? Sidney, why are you so interested in running a hybrid committee? Part of it is because it's undergone a long time development process. As I told you, I started doing Model United Nations when I was a freshman in high school. And in high school, I was very, very active in crises. I always went to crisis committee. One of my favorite ones was the Egyptian Revolution Committee. And then now in college, I do a lot of Ecosoc committees as a competitor. So I think that mix has given me a perspective of what the best of the both worlds are and how we can craft a more substantive committee experience by putting those two together. I've also run the non-governmental organizations program at HMUN Boston, and I'm also the Undersecretary General for the Economic and Social Council and regional bodies for HMUN Boston this coming year. And through seeing the ideas people have for their committees, And through being involved in running a crisis talk myself, I think there are a lot of educational benefits to doing such a thing. And also, it's really fun. You get to see how your resolution messed up or really worked. But I think at the core, why I'm running a crisis subcommittee is because of my philosophy of Model United Nations. I think Model UN is both a practice and a competition. I think oftentimes people will tell you one of the two, that you shouldn't treat Model UN as a competition, that it's there for you to learn, and for you to learn more about stuff that's not taught at school, about international affairs. So once you get to college or once you get into the real world, you'll have that at the back of your mind. Other people tell you that Model UN has to be a competition, that winning awards is what makes it fun. I agree with neither of those and also both of those. I think the fact that it is a competition helps the educational aspect, although making it too competitive oftentimes blinds what people can learn from it. And I think, obviously, that the Ecosoc style committee combines both of the two worlds, the best of both worlds. First, on the philosophy of the Model United Nations as a practice, I want to talk about realism. Nothing ever operates purely like a GA or Ecosoc committee or in crisis style. There's always a mix. Important topics must always be addressed in the most applicable way. As an example, in the actual UN, once you pass the resolution, it doesn't just sit there and like starts getting implemented. Most United Nations resolutions are never implemented because they're not ratified by the countries, because the United Nations just doesn't have the financial resources to implement it. I think oftentimes in Model UN we think that the United Nations is some omnipotent body that has an infinite amount of resources and time at its hands to get the ball rolling. And that's often not the case. If it doesn't address something in 1 or 2 years, it could be the next world crisis. And I think being reflective about that is very important to make Model UN a realist practice, a realist simulation of the United Nations. The second part is the philosophy of Model United Nations as a competition. I think of Model United Nations as a game of politics and less as a simulation of the United Nations. What that means is that collaboration, dissent, strategy, tactics, influence are key elements of a thriving Model United Nations conference. Similarly, in the United Nations, to the greatest degree, is important to ensure the realism of a conference, but at its very core, the most you can take away from Model United Nations is learning what politics is like, how to navigate around those sticky political situations when many powers and points of influence are at play. And I think that's one of the most applicable real-world skills you can take from MUN. Politics are always subject to context. They're never static. I might like you one day because you support my policy, and I might dislike you the other day because if you support my policy, it makes me look bad. And the dependencies each actor has, the constituency, what they're considering, the future of their politics are all things that you yourself, as a political actor, have to consider in this kind of game. Also, and I think most importantly, with the current way Model United Nations is run as a competition, it's really easy to get entrenched early on. And I think Crisis Talks address this on 4 very important fronts. First is on blocks and debate. Crisis Talks ensure that the blocks we form aren't permanent, thereby creating richer debate. With a regular GA or Ecosoc committee, there might be some slippage between blocks, there might be some merging. But at the end of the day, if you're not the person founding a block, once you get to the resolution, you're probably not also the person getting to advocate for the resolution, getting up there and presenting the resolution. And I think it's a testament to leadership to be able to present the resolution, advocate for the resolution, but oftentimes the opportunities for that are too scarce because they're decided on the first day, right? Whoever people want to listen to, they listen to, and then it never really changes once the conference rolls forward. The second one, and on a related point, is leadership. Ecosoc given an opportunity to delegates who were unable to lead and shine in the first half of the committee to gain influence in the second part. Once the crises and the directives start coming out, you'll have other opportunities to create new blocks around existing resolutions, or maybe take your old block and show some new leadership to be agile, to ensure that you're still the one coming up with the best solution to the problem that's being posed. Third part is performance. Ecosoc reward specialized knowledge about the topic in contrast to general broad knowledge, and that allows for a more mature discussion later on in the conference. I think in a GA or Ecosoc committee, it's really easy to focus on the first two sessions of the committee, maybe even first three days of the committee, and then on the last part of the third day or on the fourth day, you just don't say anything anymore because you know that you have no stake in the resolution. And I think that's the worst thing to do, because that's the most exciting part of the MALD-UN conference, when you're deciding which policy to take. And because there's an incentive for you to get involved later on through these crisis breaks, you'll be able to jump in and participate once again. And finally, when I'm looking at this as a judge, as a director, I think Ecosocs are more holistic. They challenge you to adapt and succeed in all situations, while also training you to be a more versatile leader and negotiator. You have to be good at both fronts to do well in a Ecosoc. Just like in the real, when you're like an ambassador, you have to be able to react quickly to the deals that are being put forth to you, while also being able to see what's happening in the long term, to be able to lead and negotiate your core as time moves on, thinking about the country's interests 5 years, 10 years down the road. And I think the way the World Social Forum will be run rewards both types of people, and also people who have both types of skills, because you have to deal with the long-term stuff in the first half and then the short-term reactionary stuff in the second half. At this point, you might be wondering, how do I prepare for the World Social Forum? Because it seems kind of weird. My first piece of advice is don't. And more specifically, don't over-prepare. Memorizing facts and statistics won't get you past the second day of conference, even if it's useful in the first. As I mentioned many times before, MALD-United Nations rewards delegates who have, yes, done their research, but most importantly can use their research to influence others, to get work done. And if you prepare too much, if you memorize too much, the debate's going to be happening in your head and not in the committee. And you want to know what your position is, know others' positions well enough to engage them on those positions, and then once you get to committee, let the ball start rolling, let that all happen. You don't want to anticipate everything all at once, because let's face it, you can't walk into committee with everything, like the world's knowledge in your head. Second is practice. Learn to think and speak on your feet. You do this already when you're blocking and negotiating, but you want to learn to do it in longer and more substantive speeches. Or if you're a GA and Ecosoc delegate, learn to speak on your feet once a new topic is proposed. Third, gain a thorough understanding of the subtopics and update paper topics. Specialized knowledge in one area will make you a valuable team member when the crises hit. If you know everything, or if you know a little bit about everything, there's very little you can contribute, because you're still going to have to write a resolution, write a directive. And if you don't contribute to the resolution or directive, it's hard to justify why you're a valuable member of the bloc. So gaining a thorough understanding of several things and not everything is most important. Fourth, stretch your mind and think creatively. Sit down and run through in your head different variations of crises that you think can occur based on what the background guide looks like and what the update papers look like. Think about how you would use resources and knowledge in an unconventional way to address those issues. Don't just think in the box, pretend the box isn't there. Finally, plan your resolution strategically. You'll be able to use the resources, programs, and policies you created in your resolution, or in the resolution that's been passed, in directives and to address a crisis. Your ability to slip those into the resolution and exploit them, write like a certain policy that you can use later on once a crisis comes out, is what you'll need to be looked highly upon. And I think it shows a lot of forethinking, it shows a lot of strategy, and also good preparation if you're able to use something that you did much earlier on. When you're preparing to write a resolution, think about what types of tools you can create, whether it's like a bank or organization or raising money for your type of NGO. There may be other ideas that you can convince your fellow delegates to give you, that you can give your fellow delegates. And also these are similar to portfolio powers and like a crisis toolbox for a crisis committee. Just because someone else gets a huge amount of resources doesn't mean that's the end of the day for you. Like power is responsibility. If you have an organization below you, or if you've created a certain amount of troops in a certain area, you're also responsible for those. Other people can take those and use them. And I think that's going to happen on a much broader level through directives. But also continue thinking about what resources you can create for yourself in the first half of committee session through the resolution that you can use later in the second half through directives. I think all in all, the World Social Forum will be a really unique and creative experience for you. It's going to force you to stretch your mind to do things. If you're an experienced Multi-United Nations delegate or a new one, to do things and try things that you might have never tried before. And also to combine, to learn more, right? To expand beyond being just a GA or Ecosoc delegate or being just a crisis delegate. And I think through stretching our own intellectual and practical horizons, through meeting delegates who come from different backgrounds, both strategically and also personally, we'll be able to grow more as students. And I'm very excited to see how that growth rolls out. So that is the end of my presentation. I think I threw a lot at you, so I definitely want to take the time to answer any questions you may have, maybe unpack some of the things I said. I think the best way to do this is to type your question into chat, and then I'll address them directly right now. So first question, how many delegates are there in the World Social Forum? So because we're still finalizing registration, we don't have an exact number, but you can expect there to be around 60. Also, the delegates, if you haven't read the background guide yet, the delegates will be all either NGOs or CSOs. NGOs are non-governmental organizations like Oxfam, Gates Foundation, Clinton Foundation, certain microfinance organizations like HMUN. The civil society organizations are organizations that may be affiliated with a government, but which aren't direct actors of that government. For example, we have the Bahrain Petroleum Company. We have actually a lot of oil companies and oil organizations in the topic because we're going to be focusing on the Middle East and North Africa. So OPEC is an example of a civil society organization that's going to be in the committee. So it'll be really interesting navigating between these government-affiliated organizations and these like privately affiliated organizations. Are there crises in Ecosoc like the OAS? Yes, there will be crises in Ecosoc. Just like the OAS, they'll be much more frequent. So it won't be your typical Ecosoc. I'm not exactly sure what they mean by, how much you can spend. So each organization will have a budget. I would caution you away from just taking money and spending in places. You want to think of ways to collaborate with organizations, with other civil society or non-governmental organizations to pool your resources. I don't know how many delegates there are in the IMF. You should ask Pavan. Is it possible for us to get an analog of a country matrix for this committee? I think what you mean by that is like a list of countries for the committee. So I think once you get to your conference, you'll have a list of you'll have a list of the non-governmental organizations within the committee. But because I don't want people to over-prepare right now, I don't think there will be a public list. But you can kind of think about which organizations will be affiliated. We have the biggest CSOs, we have the biggest NGOs in the committee. So think about which of those organizations will be in the committee and prepare from that front. Also, I wouldn't think about approaching the committee in terms of which organizations are a part of it, but instead which blocks are part of it. Thinking along blocks will also help you think more strategically about which types of people you need to engage, which types of people you'll need to negotiate or debate with. And that's a lot more helpful and important once you get to conference. The DRC is an NGO. Are there people representing huge NGOs like Oxfam? Yes, there will be huge NGOs in there. I think Oxfam is actually one of the NGOs in there. And everyone can be sponsors on resolutions. So just to clarify, there aren't any countries in this committee. They're all NGOs and they're all CSOs. So we're going to use standard Model United Nations procedure, but essentially anyone can sponsor a resolution. It's not limited to countries because we don't have any countries. Are there any other questions? Maybe about like the procedure of how NGO is going to run, or more on the philosophy of why we're doing this? In terms of if you have like specific terms or organizations that you want to learn more about, because I'm the director, I don't want to directly give you the information because I want to equalize the playing ground for everyone. I want to give everyone an equal opportunity to do their research. So if you want to learn more about things like social entrepreneurship or Ashoka, there are tons of resources online. There are many books that Ashoka has published that you can look into. Any other questions? That's a good question. What is an ideal delegate of the World Social Forum? I think it's very hard to say. So when I was interviewing assistant directors, I asked them, what's your idea of a best delegate? And everyone's answers were different. I think it's very hard to say what exactly makes a best delegate, or what makes an ideal delegate an ideal delegate. I think the most important thing when it comes to being a good delegate in a committee is knowing what to say, saying it well, and getting people to say what you say. So to repeat that, three things: knowing what you say, saying it well, and getting people to say what you say. Meaning you have to be prepared, you have to be eloquent and ready to speak and take action, and also ready to influence people to agree with you or compromise with you. And I think if you can do that consistently and to a large extent, you have a very good shot at being best delegate. I think that still applies for the World Social Forum. It's just that you'll have to do that in more iterations, more frequently, the whole cycle more frequently, because you'll be coming across things like directives and crises in the second half of committee. Let me know if that was clear enough. Is there any sort of foreign policy for NGOs or CSOs? Yes, and much more than there are for countries. I think you can think about this as you can think about NGOs and CSOs as actors that represent many countries at once and are still interacting with many countries. So their foreign policy is actually a lot more contingent on which countries they're involved in and what their mission statement is than on which country they represent, because they represent many countries, they're involved in many countries, and they have different interests in those countries. And also those interests translate to their perspectives on how other countries or other organizations influence their work. So I would think about it less of as a foreign policy and more as a mission statement with certain perspectives attached to it, because there are policies NGOs have to both their work within their countries and also other work by other NGOs in maybe other countries, or maybe even in the same country. And that applies to CSOs too. Any other questions? How do we form blocks? So that's a hard one. I think a block, I mean, by definition, a block is a group of people with common interests. Maybe not the same interests, but with several interests in common. And your ability to reach out to people, note that you have common interests, and note that you can work on a policy together, and also show them that you have a good idea for that policy is important in forming a bloc. Our committee will only deal with the Middle East and North Africa, although the policies in the resolution should apply to any NGO anywhere, and I'll say that again during the conference. The topics and the crises will only be in the Middle East and North Africa, but the policies that are released, the policies in the resolution should be applicable everywhere. In terms of the question, in the background, I didn't mention that blocks are formed based on religion, humanitarian aid, and locality. Which aspect do we consider? You should consider everything because NGOs are formed. The NGOs have missions that are dependent on each of those things, and in order for you to be successful, you have to consider the interests of those NGOs based on those things. It's just like saying, this country puts a big emphasis on their petroleum economy because they're a petroleum exporting country. But this other one, they focus on technology because that's the biggest part of their economy. And this third one doesn't even care about their economy at all. They're all about exporting communism to other countries. So you have to consider that and use it in your negotiation. Consider everything and use it in your negotiation. Any other questions? All right. Oh, we have one more. Won't the perspective change based on the NGO or CSO? Oh, yeah. So some NGOs or CSOs emphasize religion before locality, some locality before religion, and I think that's going to be a very interesting variable. Um, I think in many issue areas, locality and religion and many of these other factors can switch. So you want to see what arguments you can make to have them emphasize religion or locality. You should treat it like any other United Nations conference when it comes to delegation policy, because each delegation will have multiple priorities, and those priorities will be ranked in a certain way. But that doesn't mean they're just going to be like that forever. You as a delegate can influence that. Moderated caucuses, as does every caucus, has a major influence on committee because in each one, new things can happen, new ideas can be proposed, new ideas can die, and how they'll be used is up to you. Do NGOs have set foreign policies, or can we change them whenever? NGOs do have set foreign policies. You should come in. So delegation policy applies to everyone. The simple rules for delegation policy. You should not be off policy. We will know if you're off policy, and that won't be good. So make sure that you research your foreign policy well and you stick to that policy. We will only be aiding states in transition. We won't be. So it will be up to the NGO to think about whether we want to engage unrecognized states like the Islamic State of Israel, of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL. It'll be up to you because some NGOs have more radical policies, others don't. So it'll be up to you to decide whether you're going to consider those organizations states in transition. All right, so I think that will be it for this webinar. It was very exciting hearing your questions and responding to, and I'll be even more excited to see you in committee debating this topic and meeting you in person. Just a few reminders before I finish. thoroughly read the background guide. If you don't read the background guide, you won't be prepared, and you're going to be wasting 4 days at a conference. So read the background guide. Read the background guide, read the update papers, and that's the first step to being prepared for the conference. If you need the password to the background guide, email info@hmunindia.org. That's INFO, info at hmunindia.org. This is because we want delegates to pay before receiving the password to ensure that you pay on time. So if you don't have it yet, make sure you email that email. If you have questions for me, or if you're from another committee, your other directors, you should email them with substantive questions. Don't email the secretariat because we'll be very confused and we'll just forward your email to the director. So just email the director directly. Their email can be found on the HMUN India website under the committees page. If you have any questions related to administrative or logistical arrangements, then you should email info@hmunindia.org. Position papers were due July 24th, so if you haven't yet, talk to your director, see if you can get an extension. Most likely that won't happen because the due date was July 24th, but talk to your director and get your position papers submitted. They should be submitted on Mondays. Please don't email them to your director because it will get lost in their email. Information about position papers can be found in your delegate preparation materials. But if you have any questions about that, make sure to let your director know. Update papers will be released very soon on the website. And if you have any other questions about the World Social Forum, feel free to email me at wsf@hmunindia.org. Yeah, and once we get to committee, I'll also be open to cover questions. I'm really excited to start engaging with you, and it'll also be a very exciting time in Hyderabad. Looking forward to it, and have a great night or great day, everyone. Thank you.